$7 was all it took to change her entire life. The message sat on the screen of Daniel Kim's phone longer than it should have. In a world where he made decisions involving millions without hesitation, this tiny number felt strangely out of place. He was standing alone in a high-rise apartment overlooking Manhattan, the city glowing beneath him like a controlled storm of light and ambition. His expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. Emily Parker had no idea who she had just texted. She was not supposed to. That was what made it interesting. Across Brooklyn, Emily sat on the edge of a narrow kitchen counter in a small, worn apartment. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind her, nearly empty except for essentials she had been stretching for days. Her phone lay in her hands, the brightness too strong for the dim room. She stared at the message she had just sent, realizing too late that she had typed the wrong number into the contact field. It was supposed to go to a friend. Instead, it had gone to a stranger. A stranger with no name saved in her phone. A stranger she now regretted disturbing. She typed quickly, apology forming in her mind, but before she could send anything, a response appeared. "Where are you?" Emily froze. It was not the reaction she expected. No confusión. No reacción. Just a direct question. Her breath slowed as uncertainty settled in. She considered ignoring it, pretending it never happened, but something about the simplicity of the reply made her hesitate. She typed slowly, "I am sorry. Wrong number." The response came almost instantly. That did not answer my question. In a glass tower, high above the city, Daniel Kim finally moved. He picked up his coat from the back of a chair, his expression calm, almost unreadable. The assistant in the adjacent room looked up in surprise as he walked toward the elevator. "Cancel my next appointment," he said quietly. There was no explanation. There never needed to be one. Meanwhile, Emily stared at her screen, unsure whether she was dealing with a joke or something worse. She had grown used to being ignored, dismissed, or overlooked. But this was different. This attention felt intentional, heavy, real. Another message appeared. "Stay where you are." Her heart tightened. She stood up immediately, looking around her small apartment as if it had suddenly become unfamiliar. The walls felt closer, the silence louder. She checked the lock on the door without thinking. Outside, the city continued as if nothing had changed. Cars moved through intersections. People walked under streetlights without hesitation. But somewhere within that same city, a black vehicle had already started moving. Daniel Kim did not rush. He never rushed. Yet for reasons he did not fully explain even to himself, he was now on his way across Manhattan toward a message that should have meant nothing at all. A simple mistake. A wrong number. $7. And a woman named Emily Parker who had no idea that her smallest moment of desperation had just crossed into the world of someone who never ignored anything once it caught his attention. The black vehicle moved through Manhattan with steady precision, avoiding unnecessary speed, as if the city itself had already been mapped into its route. Inside, Daniel Kim sat in silence, his attention resting not on the road ahead, but on the message that had disrupted his evening. $7. He had seen larger requests from people trying to manipulate access, sympathy, or opportunity. This one was different. It carried no strategy, no performance, no attempt to appear important. It was simply a mistake, yet it had pulled him out of his routine without resistance. Across Brooklyn, Emily Parker stood near her apartment window, watching the street below as if expecting something she could not name. She had not sent another message. She had not called anyone. There was nothing she could do except wait and regret pressing the wrong contact. The idea that a stranger might actually respond, let alone act on it, felt unreasonable. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ignore the growing tension in her chest. Minutes later, headlights slowed outside her building. Emily stepped back instinctively. A car stopped directly in front of the entrance. No logos, no indication of identity. Just presence, heavy and deliberate. She watched as a man stepped out first, opening the rear door without hesitation. From where she stood, she could not see his face clearly, only the controlled movements of someone accustomed to being followed without question. A second later, A knock echoed through the hallway outside her apartment door. Not aggressive, not hesitant, simply certain. Emily froze. Every rational thought told her not to open it. Every instinct told her she had no reason to be afraid. Yet her body reacted as if the opposite were true. Another knock came, identical in rhythm. Calm, patient. Finally, she moved. Slowly, she approached the door and looked through the peephole. What she saw made her pause longer than she expected. A man stood outside wearing a dark coat, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. There was no urgency in him, no irritation, only focus. Emily hesitated before unlocking the door. The moment it opened, cold hallway air entered the apartment. The man did not step inside immediately. Instead, he looked at her, as if confirming something he already knew. Emily Parker, he said quietly. Hearing her own name spoken by a stranger sent a strange tension through her chest. She nodded slightly. I think there has been a mistake, she said quickly. I sent something to the wrong number. The man did not react the way she expected. He did not ask questions about confusion or identity. Instead, he simply lifted a small paper bag in his hand. Inside were neatly packed groceries, enough to fill a kitchen that had clearly been stretched too thin for too long. There is no mistake, he said calmly. Emily looked at the bag, then back at him. I do not understand. A faint pause followed, as if he were deciding how much to explain. Finally, he spoke again. You asked for $7 worth of food, he said. This is more efficient. The sentence made no emotional appeal. No judgment. No sympathy. Just logic. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, unable to reconcile the simplicity of his words with the weight of his presence. From the hallway behind him, other figures remained silent, waiting without interruption. Inside her apartment, everything suddenly felt smaller, not because it had changed, but because someone new had entered her reality without asking permission. And in that moment, Emily realized this was no longer about a wrong number. It was about why someone had chosen to answer it. Emily Parker did not move at first. The paper bag in Daniel Kim's hand remained suspended between them, like an answer she had not agreed to accept. The hallway behind him stayed silent, the other figures still and observant, giving no indication of interruption or urgency. Everything about the moment felt controlled, as if it had been arranged long before she opened the door. Emily tightened her grip on the doorframe. I think you have a wrong idea, she said carefully. I'm not asking for help like this. I just made a mistake. Daniel looked at her without changing expression. There was no offense in his eyes, no confusion, no attempt to correct her emotionally. Only understanding, quiet and precise. Mistakes still reveal conditions, he said. The sentence did not comfort her. It only made her more aware of how little she knew about the man standing in front of her. Emily glanced at the bag again. Inside, she could see packaged food, fresh items, and small essentials she had not been able to afford for weeks. Her stomach tightened, not from hunger alone, but from the weight of accepting something she never asked for. Why are you doing this? She asked finally. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he shifted his attention briefly to the apartment behind her, taking in the narrow hallway, the worn furniture, the quiet absence of anything unnecessary. When he spoke again, his voice remained steady. Because you asked a question the city usually ignores. Emily frowned slightly. I did not ask a question. You did, he replied. You just used numbers instead of words. That response stayed in the air longer than anything else he had said. Emily stepped back slightly, uncertain whether to continue the conversation or end it immediately. Her instincts told her this was not normal generosity. It was structured, deliberate, almost analytical in nature. Daniel finally extended the bag again. Take it, he said simply. It solves an immediate problem. Emily hesitated. Every part of her life had been built on managing problems herself, even when it was difficult. Accepting help from a stranger, especially one like this, felt like crossing a boundary she could not clearly define. Yet the reality behind her, nearly empty cabinets, unpaid bills stacked neatly on the counter, her mother sleeping in the next room without knowing how tight things had become, made refusal feel equally impossible. Slowly, she reached out and took the bag. The weight surprised her, not because it was heavy, but because it felt real in a way her situation rarely did. "This does not change anything," she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "It is not meant to change everything." A pause followed. The hallway remained still, the other figures unmoving, as if waiting for something that had already been decided. Emily looked up again. "Then what is it meant for?" For the first time, Daniel's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but through her situation, as if mapping something larger than the apartment itself. "To show that you were heard," he said. The words landed softly but firmly. Not emotional, not persuasive, just final. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she held the bag closer, her fingers tightening around the handles. She had expected judgment, pity, or at best a transaction. What she received instead felt more complicated. Recognition, from someone who should not have been paying attention at all. As Daniel turned slightly toward the hallway, preparing to leave, Emily spoke again without fully understanding why. "Wait." He stopped, but did not turn completely. She hesitated, then asked the only question that had begun forming since the moment he arrived. "Who are you?" The silence that followed was longer than before. And in that silence, Emily realized the answer might not be something she was ready to understand. Emily Parker stood still in the doorway long after the question left her lips. "Who are you?" The words did not echo in the hallway. They simply hung there, unanswered, as if the space itself refused to provide clarity. Daniel Kim had not yet moved. His presence remained steady, controlled, and almost indifferent to urgency. The paper bag of food remained in Emily's hands, reminding her that whatever the situation was, it was still real. Finally, Daniel turned slightly back toward her. Not fully, just enough to acknowledge the question without fully opening the door to it. "That is not important right now," he said. The answer frustrated her more than silence would have. Emily tightened her grip on the bag. "If you're going to appear at my door with food and answer messages that were not meant for you, I think it is important." There was a pause. Daniel studied her for a moment longer, as if deciding how much truth was necessary. Around them, the hallway remained empty and still, the other figures having already stepped back without instruction. It was only the two of them now. Finally, he spoke again. "My name is Daniel Kim." The simplicity of it did not resolve anything for Emily. If anything, it expanded the questions. The name did not match the situation. It did not explain why a man like him would respond to a mistake involving $7. She shifted slightly in place. Why would someone like you even see that message? Daniel's expression remained unchanged. "Because I do not ignore what reaches me directly." The sentence carried no emotion, only structure. Emily looked down at the bag again, then back up at him. "That still does not explain why you came here yourself." For the first time, Daniel paused longer before answering. The silence between them felt heavier than before, not because of fear, but because of unanswered logic. "Some messages are not about money," he said finally. "They are about condition." Emily frowned slightly. "Condition?" Daniel nodded once. $7 is not the point. It is what it represents when someone decides it is worth sending to a stranger. The meaning of his words settled slowly. Emily did not like how accurately they reflected her situation. She had not told anyone how close everything had become. Not fully, not in detail. Yet this man, standing in her hallway because of a wrong number, seemed to understand more than she expected. She looked away briefly, collecting her thoughts. "I still do not understand what you want from this," she said quietly. Daniel adjusted his coat slightly, preparing to leave. "Nothing," he replied. That answer confused her even more than the food or the visit. "Then why come at all?" she asked again, her voice sharper now. Not from anger, but from the discomfort of being seen too clearly. Daniel stopped at the threshold. For a moment, it seemed like he might not answer. Then he spoke without turning fully back. "Because most people only respond when it is convenient," he said. "You did not." Emily stood frozen as he continued. "That tells me more about you than your message did." A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not safe either, simply unresolved. Daniel stepped into the hallway, the movement controlled and unhurried. Before leaving completely, He paused once more. "Eat tonight," he said. "After that, decide what you will do with tomorrow." Then he was gone. The hallway returned to silence. Emily remained standing in her doorway, holding the bag of food that had arrived because of a mistake she still did not fully understand. But now, the mistake no longer felt random. It felt like the beginning of something she had not yet named. That night, Emily Parker sat alone at her small kitchen table with a paper bag still untouched in front of her. The apartment felt quieter than usual, not because anything had changed externally, but because something inside her had shifted and refused to settle back into place. The food inside the bag was real, tangible, immediate, yet her thoughts were elsewhere, circling the man who had delivered it without hesitation, without negotiation, and without asking for anything in return. She replayed his words again and again. $7 is not the point. It is what it represents when someone decides it is worth sending to a stranger. Emily leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She had sent that message out of embarrassment, not intention. A mistake born from exhaustion and financial pressure. Yet Daniel Kim had treated it as something meaningful, something worth responding to, something worth arriving in person for. She stood up and walked slowly to the counter, opening the refrigerator. It was still nearly empty, but now there were signs of change. Fresh items she had not seen in weeks. Milk, fruit, packaged meals. Everything arranged with quiet precision, as if even generosity had structure in his world. She closed the refrigerator and exhaled slowly. For the first time in a long time, she did not immediately think about what was missing. Instead, she thought about what had arrived. The next morning, Emily went to work as usual, but her focus was different. Tasks she normally completed on autopilot now felt slightly sharper, as if her mind had been quietly reorganized. During a short break, she checked her phone. No new messages. She told herself that was normal. There was no reason for anything else. Yet part of her still expected something. Not because she wanted help, but because she could not fully understand why help had already come. Meanwhile, in a high-rise office across Manhattan, Daniel Kim stood near a large window, reviewing reports without visible urgency. His assistant placed documents on the desk, but hesitated before speaking. "The woman from last night," she said carefully. Daniel did not look away from the window. "Her name is Emily Parker," he replied. The assistant nodded. "Are there any instructions regarding continued contact?" For a brief moment, Daniel remained silent. The city stretched beneath him, indifferent and endless. "No instructions," he said finally. "Just observation." The assistant left quietly, leaving him alone with the skyline. Daniel returned his attention to the glass, but his focus was no longer on numbers or reports. It was on patterns. Human behavior rarely shifted from a single interaction, yet in Emily Parker's case, something had already begun to change. Not in action, but in awareness. Across the city, Emily finished her shift and stepped outside into the evening air. She paused before walking home, looking at the street as if seeing it slightly differently than before. The world had not changed. Her circumstances had not changed. But something unfamiliar had entered her life without permission and refused to leave quietly. A question formed in her mind, not spoken aloud, but persistent nonetheless. Why would someone like Daniel Kim notice someone like her at all? And more importantly, what happened next if he did not stop? Over the following days, Emily Parker's life continued in its usual structure, but the presence of Daniel Kim remained in the background like a quiet shift in gravity she could not ignore. There were no further dramatic appearances, no sudden arrivals at her door, no additional deliveries that disrupted her routine. Yet the absence of escalation did not create distance. Instead, it created awareness. She found herself noticing details she had previously overlooked. The stability of her daily routine felt more visible now, almost as if she were observing it from slightly outside herself. At work, Emily completed her tasks efficiently, but her mind occasionally drifted back to the encounter. The man who had shown up because of a mistaken message had not behaved like anyone she had ever met. There had been no negotiation, no hesitation, and no visible expectation of return. Only structure, only intention. One evening after finishing her shift, Emily stopped at a small grocery store near her apartment. She did not need much, only a few items to replace what had been used from the unexpected delivery. Standing in the aisle, she hesitated longer than expected before choosing simple necessities. Not because she cannot decide, but because the act itself now felt different. She was no longer selecting based purely on limitation. She was considering continuity. When she returned home, she placed the bags on the counter and sat down without turning on the television or checking her phone. The apartment felt quieter than before, but not empty in the same way. Something had been added to her awareness that did not leave easily. Meanwhile, Daniel Kim reviewed reports late in the evening from his office overlooking the city. His attention moved through data, projections, and structured updates with the same precision as always. Yet intermittently, his focus returned to a single variable that was not part of any formal report. Emily Parker had not reached out again. She had not attempted to extend the interaction or request anything further. That in itself was notable. Most individuals, when offered even minimal assistance from someone in his position, tended to escalate expectations. She had not. Instead, she had retreated into silence while continuing her life as before. Daniel closed the folder in front of him and leaned back slightly. The decision he had made to respond to that message still held no conventional justification. It was not efficiency. It was not obligation. It was something else that did not require definition, yet still influenced observation. Across the city, Emily eventually picked up her phone and opened the message thread again. She did not type anything. She simply looked at the name she had once considered a mistake. Daniel Kim. The conversation remained unchanged, frozen at the point where he had told her to eat and decide what tomorrow would be. She wondered whether she was supposed to forget it or whether it was meant to continue in a way she did not yet understand. As she set the phone down, a new realization formed slowly and without urgency. The moment he had arrived at her door was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a pattern she had not yet learned to recognize. And somewhere in the city, Daniel Kim was already aware that patterns, once noticed, rarely disappeared on their own. The following week began without any clear change in Emily Parker's external life. Yet internally, she felt as if she were moving through a slightly altered version of her routine. The same streets, the same early morning train, the same sequence of tasks at work still defined her days. However, her attention no longer stayed fully within those boundaries. At unpredictable moments, she found herself recalling details she had not considered important before. The calm way Daniel Kim had spoken, the absence of hesitation in his actions, the way he treated a simple mistake as something worth responding to instead of ignoring. These thoughts did not dominate her mind, but they returned often enough that she could no longer dismiss them as random curiosity. One evening, as Emily finished her shift and stepped outside into the cool air, she noticed a black car parked farther down the street than usual traffic would explain. It was not directly in her path, yet its presence felt deliberate. She slowed slightly, but continued walking. As she passed, the vehicle did not move, nor did anyone exit. Still, she could not ignore the brief tension that rose in her chest. She told herself it meant nothing. New York was full of expensive cars and unfamiliar people. Yet the feeling lingered longer than logic. That night at home, Emily finally opened the small folder Daniel had left behind during their first encounter. She had not fully examined it before, too overwhelmed by the situation itself. Now, sitting at her kitchen table, she carefully reviewed the contents. The documents inside were structured, formal, and detailed. They outlined opportunities for skill development and professional advancement, all tied to organizations she had only seen from a distance. There were no demands, no obligations written in forceful language, only structured pathways and options. Emily leaned back in her chair, trying to understand why someone would place something like this in front of her without expecting immediate acceptance. Meanwhile, Daniel Kim stood in a private office overlooking the city, reviewing information that had been quietly compiled over the past several days. Not surveillance in the traditional sense, but observation of patterns. employment history, financial strain indicators, routine behavior. Nothing invasive, yet enough to form a clearer understanding of the environment Emily Parker was navigating. An assistant entered quietly and placed a tablet on the desk. She has not responded to any of the program details yet, the assistant said. Daniel did not look up immediately. She is not the type to respond quickly, he replied. The assistant hesitated. Should we continue outreach? Daniel paused for a moment, then shook his head slightly. No pressure, he said. Let it remain her decision. The assistant left, and silence returned to the room. Daniel turned his attention back to the city beyond the glass. He had seen many individuals respond quickly to opportunity, usually driven by urgency or need. Emily Parker was different. Her hesitation was not resistance. It was evaluation. Across the city, Emily closed the folder and placed it carefully back on the table. She did not yet understand what kind of situation she had entered, but she was beginning to recognize that it was no longer accidental. Somewhere between a wrong number and a structured opportunity, her life had been redirected without force, yet with undeniable intent. And the most unsettling part was not the presence of Daniel Kim in her life, but the growing realization that he might not disappear from it anytime soon. The days following Emily Parker's review of the program materials brought a quiet, but noticeable shift in how she moved through her routine. Nothing in her external circumstances had changed dramatically, yet her perception of them had begun to evolve in subtle ways. The work at the hotel remained physically demanding, the apartment remained small and modest, and her responsibilities toward her mother remained constant. However, the idea that her life might extend beyond survival no longer felt abstract. It felt slightly more present, as if it had moved one step closer without fully revealing itself. At the same time, Daniel Kim maintained his distance. There were no new visits, no unexpected appearances, no further deliveries left at her door. Yet his absence did not feel like disconnection. Instead, it felt like controlled space, as if he were allowing something to develop without interference. Emily noticed this most when she checked her phone during brief breaks in her day. The message thread remained unchanged, but she found herself revisiting it more often than necessary. Not because she expected immediate communication, but because the silence itself felt intentional. One evening, after returning home from work, Emily found a small envelope placed outside her apartment door. There was no stamp, no return address, only her name written in clean, precise handwriting. Inside was a single page. It was not an offer, nor an instruction, but a schedule. Structured training sessions, assessment milestones, and optional development tracks were outlined in clear, minimal formatting. At the bottom of the page, one sentence stood alone. You decide the pace. Emily sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, reading it several times. The concept of choice felt heavier than she expected, not because she lacked options, but because she had rarely been in a position where her decisions could extend beyond immediate necessity. Meanwhile, Daniel Kim stood in a quiet office late at night, reviewing updates on ongoing program participants. The information was presented in concise reports, focusing on progress indicators and behavioral adaptation patterns. When Emily Parker's file appeared on the screen, he paused longer than usual. There was no dramatic change in her data. No sudden improvement or decline, only consistency, stability under uncertainty. That, in his assessment, was more significant than volatility. His assistant entered briefly. The next phase begins next week, she said. Daniel nodded without turning away from the screen. She will decide whether to continue, he replied. The assistant hesitated, and if she does not, Daniel finally looked away from the monitor. His expression remained calm, but deliberate. Then she was never part of it, he said simply. Across the city, Emily placed the document carefully back on her table and sat in silence for a long time. For years, her life had been defined by reacting to circumstances she could not control. But now, for the first time, she was being asked to choose a direction that did not begin with survival. Outside her window, the city continued its endless movement, unaware of the quiet decision forming inside a small apartment. And somewhere beyond the lights and noise, Daniel Kim waited without urgency, as if he already understood that the most important changes never arrived quickly, but only when a person was finally ready to accept them. The morning arrived without ceremony, as it always did, but for Emily Parker it no longer felt identical to the mornings before. She stood in her small kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold, staring at the folded document placed neatly on her table. The schedule inside it represented something she had never seriously allowed herself to consider before. Not just work, not just survival, a structure that suggested progression, a path that extended beyond the immediate pressures of her life. She read the same lines again and again, as if repetition might reveal hidden conditions. But there were none. Only clarity. Only choice. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel Kim reviewed the final phase of participant integration for the program. The reports on his desk were minimal, focused entirely on performance indicators and behavioral consistency. When Emily Parker's name appeared among the advancing candidates, there was no visible reaction from him. However, his attention lingered slightly longer than necessary, not because her results were exceptional in the conventional sense, but because they were stable in a way that suggested long-term adaptability rather than short-term performance. His assistant stood nearby, waiting for instruction. "She has accepted the next phase," she said after reviewing the confirmation log. Daniel nodded once. "Expected," he replied. There was no satisfaction in his voice, only acknowledgement. For him, this was not a moment of success or reward. It was continuation. Later that day, Emily arrived at the training facility earlier than required. The building was quieter in the morning, the halls less crowded, the atmosphere more focused. She noticed immediately that the environment had changed slightly in tone. Participants who had once treated the program as temporary now carried themselves differently, as if recognizing that continuation required commitment rather than curiosity. Emily took her seat in silence, placing the folded schedule in front of her. When the session began, the instructor did not speak about motivation or encouragement. Instead, he spoke about responsibility, about decisions that extend beyond individual benefit, about leadership that is measured through consistency rather than recognition. Emily listened carefully, not missing a word. When the first exercise was assigned, the group dynamic shifted quickly. This time, the challenge was not about solving a problem, but about sustaining an approach under increasing pressure. As the task progressed, several participants began to lose structure, reacting emotionally to shifting constraints. Emily found herself returning to the same principle she had developed in earlier sessions. Break complexity into manageable parts. Focus on what can be controlled. Ignore unnecessary noise. When she applied this method again, the results stabilized her group. Not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently enough that others began to align with her approach without formal instruction. Across the room, observers recorded the change without comment. It was not a breakthrough moment. It was something quieter, something more durable. After the session ended, Emily remained in her seat longer than the others. She looked down at her hands, realizing that nothing around her had fundamentally changed in appearance. Yet her perception of possibility had shifted in a way she could no longer ignore. Outside the building, Daniel Kim stood at a distance where he could observe the exit without being seen. He did not approach. He did not intervene. He simply watched as participants left one by one, including Emily Parker, who paused briefly at the doorway before stepping into the city. There was no dramatic recognition between them. No visible acknowledgement. Only continuation. As Emily walked down the street, she held the schedule inside her bag without touching it, aware now that the decision she had made was no longer about accepting help or refusing it. It was about stepping into a version of her life that required her to become someone she had not yet fully learned to be. And somewhere behind her, without urgency or expectation, Daniel Kim remained still, observing not her circumstances, but her trajectory.